It's always been a confusing question. You'd say that all disruptors are innovators, but not necessarily all innovators are disruptors. I like to think about disruption being more on affecting something of more value from a business perspective itself. So you're going to uproot an existing traditional business and overhaul how they're basically been doing stuff in terms of connecting with customers itself. So I would say disruptive would add more business perceived value to it. Innovation could just be from an experimental, inventive perspective. But that makes something bigger, faster, and stronger. But when you apply a business case to it and get to challenge an existing industry, I would say that will be where disruption comes in.
So, what does disruptive business model really mean?
So it means that you're going against an existing established company. So you could say there's upstart companies rather than startup companies itself. You're changing how they interact with their customers. I like to think a bit from a customer standpoint. If their customers are always been stagnant and left and bored, and they've not been looking at their customers and trying to find new ways to get to customers right now, that would normally be areas of establishments that's ready to be disrupted, like what we've seen recently in Malaysia with the taxi industry itself. I guess there's no real science towards it. The whole idea is to find out what a frustration or pain points people have with existing statements or problems in the market and find out how would you address that itself. As long as you could address the customer's standpoint, I guess that's the way to get in and disrupt any particular stuff. But the main thing when it comes to a company that really wants to disrupt is can you get to critical mass as fast as possible? And that doesn't necessarily mean that it can be done cheaply. You may need funds to basically achieve this, to acquire as many users to the point that it is labeled as disruptive enough itself. Definitely, to be disruptive, it's always equated to being profitable. Is it definitely profitable? Eventually it will be because you're getting that critical mass of users, and users, it means traction, traction means funds, possibly an exit itself. I wouldn't say that this is only for larger organizations. I see a lot of startups coming into the space, albeit because of the reason of some of the bigger companies are too complacent with where they are, how they're dealing with this particular problem statements in the first place. And the startups are willing to come in and experiment and basically try new ideas that the bigger boys would never do. Because they always want to play it safe, startups don't play it safe. I guess sometimes it's not fair to say that when a bigger company tries something and fails, it's looked and frowned upon. But when a startup tries to fail, it says that's a successful experiment that they failed fast, and then they move on itself. But yeah, bigger companies normally are afraid of fail, and that's where startups has the advantage to get into a disruptive ecosystem. I guess they wouldn't really implement the model, it just happens in. Again, I bring it back to the customer standpoint. It's a natural evolution. Wherever you find frustrated customers, you're going to see disruptive technologies. We've seen it with public transportation, that's being disrupted. The education sector, health, these are some of the customer-facing industries itself. So as long as it's facing customers, these are areas that is meant to be disruptive. How we look for places to stay, hotels, last-minute hotel bookings, Airbnb, how we access public transportation, especially cabs within Southeast Asia market. I was never a fan initially of my taxi, but I found that it creeped into my life every time I'm in Singapore. There's no way I don't use Grab Taxi to basically get a taxi. So yeah, some of these spaces would be from transportation, accommodation. That's the one that directly affects me as a traveler and a business person. I get affected by those itself. The other bigger stuff that we see is from an education standpoint, and also bigger brick and mortar businesses, government sectors itself. People are finding ways to engage with the end customer, bypassing a lot of the big boys. Airline industries, you see that being disrupted also. That's something that you always thought the big boys would basically figure out. but smaller companies can grow to that equatable big-sized companies and disrupt them itself. Look at what Virgin is basically doing. Look at what Tesla has basically done with the car industry itself, taking electronic cars and putting out the patents out there for anyone to basically disrupt that right now. So it's basically cutting across every vertical that has frustrated customers. That's the main thing. Every vertical, I think you're going to see large disruptions by startups in every single vertical, starting with the most prevalent ones in Southeast Asia would be payments. People are frustrated on how to deal with banking systems itself, especially with Southeast Asia countries, emerging markets rather than third world countries, I'll call them. Payments always been an issue. Not everyone has a credit card, but it doesn't mean they don't have cash. So how they would basically get the cash across from one person to another, that would be the one that I want to see get disrupted as soon as possible. Bitcoins may be the one that basically makes it possible, but other cashless transactions would basically be meant for Southeast Asia. Education will be disrupted. We're already looking into stuff within Indonesia. Universities are figuring out a way they could leverage on let's say people like us in KL or even further away, education institutes to bring in content to them on a wide scheme of platforms, basically using the web to go across all the islands and all the 270 million people, 300 universities across the whole Indonesia to have access to education they could never have, and it bypasses a lot of governments and huge organizations right to the consumers itself. So those are some of the verticals we're looking at. I guess part of the disruptiveness, if you look at most of the solutions, have always been mobile first. If you compare how people engage with traditional services from making an order online through e-commerce from traditional desktop, when you look into the West how they do it and the East, which is here in Asia, how they do it, on the East side, which is here, it's more prevalent on mobile. Mobile comes first for everything except for streaming content, which might be slow due to bandwidth issues. So we go back to the desktop for video and stuff like that. But every other single vertical that we look at, from healthcare to education to gamification to anything, mobile comes first in this part of the world. So if I was to do any particular startup or any kind of business model I'm trying to venture into, it will be a mobile first approach, and that will be the most disruptive because everyone has a screen in their pockets itself. I would say you always need to be a domain expert in whatever you do. So look at what you are an expert in. So if you're a student right now, find out how could you make student life better in terms of transportation for students, education for students, anything that involves the student life. You are the center of it. You are an expert in that, and nobody could know it better than you. Figure out what you could do bigger, better, faster, stronger in that field, and use that platform of you are a student in an ecosystem at a university. I think you can launch something within your campus easier than an outsider could come in. You could find friends in other campuses to do the same for you. I think you could disrupt the education vertical faster than an outsider could itself. So do that.